Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends, it's Matt Bailey here, the branch director for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society here in Australia. And today we're talking about colour. We're talking about the colour of whisky and how even the most seasoned whisky nerd and whisky drinker and appreciator can often be fooled by colour. Now, I would call myself a long-term whisky appreciator, whisky geek, whisky nerd if you like, and even I and even my colleagues still get fooled by colour. It happens to all of us. Now in front of me right now are two whiskies from the SMWS. One of them is 15 years old, the other one is also 15 years old. They're both 15-year-old single cask strength whiskies. One of them is code 2.135 Apple Sherbet Crumble, delicious whiskey. And the other one is 85.69 an Air of Grandeur. Both lovely whiskies, both very different flavour profiles. We've got juicy oak and vanilla, deep rich and dried fruits. And here we have two whiskies that are remarkably different colour in the glass. Now we're going to talk about colour for a second and what that means, what the colour means, and how it affects the whisky and how that perception goes. So, we use green glass at the Society. Most whiskies, except the Heresy range, most of the whiskies come in this green glass, so you can barely actually make out the colour when it's in the bottle. If you look closely up through a light source, you might be able to spot it. But generally speaking, you can't spot the colour because we use the green glass. That also prevents UV rays from damaging your whiskey as well. And you should probably not keep your whiskey in the sun ever, really, unless you're having it outside and drinking a dram, but don't store your whiskey in a place where it collects natural sunlight. But what does colour mean in a whiskey? Let's really break it down for a second here. The colour of a whiskey predominantly comes from the cask. Now, when whiskey goes into a cask, when that new make spirit goes into a cask, it goes in clear. It's a new make spirit. It comes off the copper stills as clear. When it goes into a cask, it attracts the colour from the influence of the wood. That influence into the colour from the wood into the spirit, I should say, comes about actually really quickly. It comes about as early as sort of the first week or two of that spirit sitting in there. So you put a spirit in the cask, whether it be a large barrel, a butt, or even a smaller cask, whatever it is, it's going to pick up that colour influence pretty quickly and pretty suddenly. Sometimes within a matter of days, even a day or two, can start picking up that colour, usually a couple of weeks, depending on the cask. And so that colour right there, quite a light pale straw sort of colour coming through on that one, that could be a whiskey that is 3 weeks old, or in this case 15 years old, but I've seen whiskies that are 40, 50, 60 years of age that look this colour. So most whiskies tend to be in that sort of straw to amber sort of colour. However, sometimes the richness of a cask, of that style of cask or previous treatment of that cask or previous use of that cask, can impart a deeper, richer, darker flavour. That's usually from things like port casks, sherry casks, and things like that, and other fortifieds. Those are darker previous uses, obviously, than ex-bourbon, which is already whiskey coloured. But then ex-port, ex-sherry fortifieds imparted a darker, richer colour. Now, the thing is, in colour in whiskey, what does it tell you about the flavour? I'll tell you right now, nothing. The colour does not tell you anything to do with flavour of the whiskey. Our brains want us to think it does, but I've honestly tasted whiskies that are this colour, that taste rich and sherried and delightful and beautifully balanced, just as I've tasted whiskies like this that are light and floral and fragrant and not at all dark as the colour would suggest. The second thing also to notice with what it tells you about flavour in terms of nothing, in that a lot of commercial whiskies are artificially coloured. Now, when you buy a core range bottle of whiskey, let's say of a big brand, I'm not going to name any, but you might see that the colour looks the same across all the bottles and all the batches all the time. Because they're not dealing in single cask whiskey, they're dealing in just homogenized whiskey. And a lot of the whiskey companies, especially the big ones, use a artificial colouring to uniform that practice. Now, it's not always used for the sake of making it look darker and bolder and richer, which it is a little bit in some cases. A lot of the time it's used for just colour consistency so that each batch looks the same. because from a consumer level of looking at those whiskies, you want them to all look the same, because then you've got a color consistency going between those batches, and that's really important. By having that color consistency, they make sure that every batch is the same, and so that it's the same for the consumer on the end of the visual impact of that whiskey. It's like if you went to McDonald's and ordered a Big Mac, and then you looked at that Big Mac before you ate it, and you enjoyed it, and the whole experience is what you expected from a Big Mac. And then when you go back to McDonald's, let's say 4 weeks later, and you order another Big Mac, and if it was slightly different, or the middle was different color, or the buns were a different color, or different shape, or different consistency, you might feel as if there is an inner part of us that goes, oh, that's not meant to be like that. Oh, there's something wrong with this one, or maybe my last one was the wrong one, and this one's the right one, and it builds a natural psychological distrust of that product. And that's why we're delving into almost consumer psychology here, but it is one of those things where you say, it's important for us to look at and go, okay, so consistency is really important here in all these whiskey brands, and that's why they all use colouring just about. We don't worry about that because everything we bottle pretty much is single cask, so the colour is always going to be from the cask, and we don't use artificial colouring at the SMWS. I can safely say most independent bottlers, as I know, don't use any artificial colouring. If there are any indie bottlers out there that do, I'd be very surprised, but it wouldn't surprise. Well, I was about to say it wouldn't surprise me, but I would be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised, but I would be a little bit disappointed. Let's put it that way. However, so the colour doesn't tell you anything about flavour. It doesn't tell you anything about sort of time in cask either. So again, I've seen whiskies that are this dark that have had 2 years in wood, versus whiskies this dark that have had 30 years in wood. So again, colour doesn't tell us anything about age, doesn't tell us anything about flavour. It just tells us that it's consistent, being matured consistently, and it's being coloured a lot of the times. Like I said, we don't bother with colouring at society because all the whiskies are presented naturally, usually as single cask, cask strength, non-chill filtered, which we'll touch on another time, and natural colour. There's no point hiding the colour because we already use green glass as well. I hope that you've learned a few things about what the colour means in a whiskey and why it's so important for most bottlers to use artificial colouring, but we don't bother with that because we're only interested in serving up the most natural whiskey from a cask. Until next time, I'm going to enjoy a whiskey without artificial colouring, maybe 2, and I'll see you all soon. Slanjava, best wishes.